Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the January 30th Grants Pass City Council Workshop. And first up on the agenda today, we have an interview with some Urban Area Planning Commission candidates. And do you all have questions in front of you? Okay, so I have some questions here too. So I think kind of what we've been doing is that I'll start off by asking a few questions, and then if you want to follow up with anything specific, you are welcome to do so. And I don't know if we have all the candidates here or if they're in a specific order, or is there somebody from the staff who's been working with the candidates?
Apologize, I thought you had the list. So first
I have their names. I just don't know if they're like all in the room or where they are.
They'll be. We have Kimberly here in the room.
Okay.
And then everybody else will be checking in at the city manager's conference room or city manager's office, and then I'll text to have her send them down.
Okay, perfect. In that case, we will be starting with Kimberly Glover, and you could come up to the podium here and make sure that the light at the base of the microphone is on.
It appears to be.
Hello.
Hello.
All right, first question. Just let us know, why would you like to join the Planning Commission?
Well, for the past decade, I've been working with different property management companies in the area. I no longer really do that, but my family has worked in growing the city as far as like housing developments, and I've been working with them for a long time on that. I've actually attended a lot of these meetings as far as like rental ordinances and things like that when we were looking to expand outside of the city, and I found that the problem we were having was that there was not a whole lot of area to expand to, and not enough contractors, it seemed. So just with that, I've stepped outside of doing the property management, but I still sometimes assist in just a go-between with developers outside in the county, properties that they're developing out in Merlin, and just being that voice between people here at the city and what they're developing out there and what we need. And I just have a lot of connections in that regard. So it's just always been a passion of mine. My family's been here since the 1850s. So yeah, it's just something that I like to do. I enjoy. I'm a busybody, but a very nervous one.
Takes some practice. All right, please describe the role of the Planning Commission and that of a commissioner.
And that of a commissioner. The Planning Commission the commission itself, I believe, is what they seek to rezone areas if need be to assist the commission if they're having issues with rezoning or just checking out the areas and what could be rezoned potentially for new either building areas as far as making it be for housing or business zoning and that nature. I'm not entirely sure what all of the jobs are for that position, but the council itself, I believe, is just they are the voice for the people here and what we want to do for the city as far as growth. And they come to these councils, they listen to the people and go with our budget and see what we can make happen if it's reasonable.
Thank you.
And you guys have to have people that help you do the side work.
Absolutely. I know you already touched on this, but I'd selected my questions in advance. Please describe your experience with land use and municipal planning and how your experience is relevant to the Planning Commission.
Yes, so that will go back to the Planning Commission as far as my family having the housing developments, part of it Sequoia Village, and then we also had Playcraft and some other areas like that. I wanted to touch on the fact that in New Orleans, I worked with the historical committee over there for a property we did. We had to source 200-year-old material, so that was a big project we did off of Dauphine. So I'm a sourcer, so I'd like you to give me a project, I will find the means for it and make it happen. So I love history. I like this town to stay its quaint self, but also expand in the ways that it needs to for further growth. But I like the quaintness of this town. I like the River City, and I like to keep that going.
Thank you. What specific skills would you bring to the Planning Commission?
Communication, I'm a pretty well-liked individual across the board, so I have excellent sourcing for funding for things. I have a lot of family that works in construction, as well as like just, I'm sorry, I'm super nervous. I have, it's like the gift of the gab, but also I work in auditing and financing and as well as property management, so I would know where to get the good deal and find the right information and source where it came from.
Thank you. Should planning code always be followed?
Well, yes, but until that extent, until you decide that maybe it needs to be revisited, things change, scenes change, but up until that point, yeah.
Planning Commission meetings are scheduled for the second and fourth Wednesdays of each month. I believe they're at 6 p.m. Is that correct, somebody? 6 p.m. Okay, can you meet this time commitment for Planning Commission meetings or other city-required functions, and are you available and willing to prepare adequately for each meeting?
I can, yes.
Thank you. Council, follow-up questions? Val?
Yes, just because I want us to hear from you and relax. We're not as scary
Yeah.
as we look as up here on the dais. Describe how you would use the city's codes and other information to balance the rights of a property owner versus those of a neighbor or groups of people who you find are in conflict on the application, because that's kind of one of the skills you have to do in that planning commission.
Well, with a lot of that, it comes down to who submitted what first. So it goes down to a timeline at that point and what's fair. It's hard to say unless you see all of the factors in it, but you have to try to make everybody see it from everybody's point of view. And you're not always going to get that, but I think at that point it is kind of a first come, first served basis. And that's kind of how you have to start. That's really all you can do in that situation, and then just go from there and inform everybody of the changes if there are changes. And if they want to make a change, then we're going to have to do it through the council. So.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? All right, thanks for being here with us today, Kimberly, and we'll be making a decision on Wednesday and get back to you either way, but thanks for stepping up. All right, next, we're going to have Scott Lindberg. Hi, Scott.
Well, hello, are we on? We are.
We are. Welcome. Thank you for being here today and applying for the UAPC. I'll be asking 6
Is now
questions,
joining.
and then if the council wants to follow up with any questions, they can do so afterwards.
Absolutely.
So first question, why do you want to join the Planning Commission?
Well, I was a planner here at the city. Well, first of all, it's still good morning. Good morning, Mayor and members of the council. I applied for this position because I was a planner with the city from 2006 until 2009, and then worked as the grants specialist for the city for the next 10 years. And now I am at Rogue Community College doing the grant work there. I applied for this position because, as they say, once a planner, always a planner. And I've always been interested in how the community is developing and how we can really be the best city that we can be. And the Planning Commission, of course, is one of the gateways to that. So I think that I have some value that I could add to the commission and help the community grow for the better.
Thank you. Please describe the role of the Planning Commission and that of a commissioner.
Well, the main job of the Planning Commission is to review the proposals that are brought before it, take any recommendations that staff has, and compare those to the Comprehensive Community Development Plan and the Development Code. There is a degree of discretion that is available, but by and large, it's applying the code as written. And if there is a type 4 procedure where there's a proposed code change, of course, it's making recommendations to the council on how best to make changes to the code or to a comprehensive plan.
Thank you. And I know you touched on this before, but please describe your experience with land use and municipal planning and/or how your experience is relevant to the role of the Planning Commission.
So the development code is written as it is for a reason, and I always saw my job as, after I was no longer a planner, as I was the grant writer, for helping younger planners, or as we called them in the upstairs, the baby planners, know why things are the way that they are. And I think that's one of the, one thing that a planner needs to do is mentor the younger and new staff in how things became the way that they are. So my schooling, I did graduate work in community and regional planning at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. And then my 3 years as a planner here, coupled with my interest in history and my research, I think makes me a good candidate for this position.
Thank you. And what specific skills would you bring to the commission?
Well, I like to, as I said, I like to research, and I'm a good listener. And I know that one of the jobs of the Planning Commission is to come to a consensus. There isn't going to be a 100% slam dunk on a lot of cases. So what I would bring is the ability to listen and to compromise and come up with a good decision that's defensible.
Thank you. Should planning code always be followed?
Well, yeah, it is. It should, with very few limited exceptions. The code was written the way that it's written. If there's something about the code that's problematic or causes trepidation, then it needs to be changed. And that's the job of the city council, is to make those changes. Planning Commission can, of course, make recommendations on that, but the code is supposed to be written, or is supposed to be followed as written, unless there is the ability to apply discretion, which is pretty limited.
Thank you. Planning Commission meetings are scheduled for the second and fourth Wednesdays of the month in the evening. Can you meet the time commitment for Planning Commission meetings and other city required functions, and are you available and willing to prepare adequately for each meeting?
Yes and yes. I waited to apply for a position such as this until my kids were older. So now is a better time in my personal and professional life to take on such a responsibility.
Thank you. Council, do you have any questions for Scott? Joel?
So reading from the same list of questions here, and it's the one that Val asked last time, describe how you would use the city's codes and other information to balance the rights of a property owner, balance those rights versus those of a neighbor or groups of people if you find they are in conflict on an application.
So that is a tough one. There is of course, everybody has heard of NIMBY, Not My Backyard, and that is a very difficult position to deal with, right? Because we have land use codes and we have, any development rights are what the community gives to the individual. That's how it happens. You do have to balance it. If the code is pretty black and white, then you have to apply the code as it's written. If there is a area for discretion or compromise, then you try to apply that the best you can. But when you get right down to it, the best defensible decision is to apply the code as it's written, especially when there are strict standards that apply to the development question.
Thank you, and thank you for your participation in city government.
Sure.
Valerie?
Yeah, I'm just going to say, and it's kind of the same, but what is your position regarding the granting of a variance to the code? And when is it justifiable? Kind of the same.
I'm sorry,
I'll
can-
read it again. What is your position regarding the granting of a variance
Oh.
to the code? And when is it justifiable?
So variances are always one of those sticky wickets, right? Because that's where you're trying to show the discretion. That's where you're trying to show why strict application of the code in that particular situation would deprive somebody of their right to develop the property as is permitted in that zoning district. My take on variances is that they should be granted very rarely and in narrow situations. That it's the responsibility of the applicant to show why strict application of the code would deprive them of the development right that they seek. Generally speaking, I believe that it's hard to show that the right is deprived by strict application of the code in most circumstances. That at least had been my experience.
Rick?
Thank you, Scott, for applying. What direction do you see being the challenges for the planning going into the future for the city?
I think one of the biggest challenges is dealing with, as Councilor King alluded, the balancing the rights and interests of neighbors in development in the community. The biggest challenge in that is probably going to be in the development of new housing.
Is now exiting.
Whether that be market rate housing or low-income housing or senior housing, or especially in infill situations. I think that's going to be one of the largest issues that the community is going to face in the next decade or so. And moreover, planning for that before it needs to happen. That's, I think, one of the biggest things that we need to do is make sure that we have our ducks in a row and be proactive.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any additional questions? All right, thanks, Scott, for
Thank
being
you.
here today. We are scheduled to, the council's scheduled to make a decision on Wednesday, and we will get back to you. Next up, we have Lois McMillan. Welcome, Lois. Please step up here to the podium. The microphone should be on. So the process here today is that I will ask you a few questions, and then if the council has any follow-ups, they can ask. And then we will be getting back, we'll be making a decision on Wednesday night and getting back to you either way. So
Wonderful.
thanks for being here. Please tell us why you would like to join the Planning Commission.
I just really enjoy, I've been on the Planning Commission before. The first time I was on, it was from 96 to 2005. And then I think it was 2007 I came back. I had had a life-changing event, so stepped away. And then came back in 2007. And then I got a chance to work in New York. Took a sabbatical to New York City for 1 year. And so I resigned then. So I really enjoyed my service on the Planning Commission. I served as chairman a few times. I just really enjoy land use.
Thank you.
I did say the second time I interviewed, I'll just be very candid, that I really find land use one of the sexier issues in when you're looking at government. So I really, really like land use.
Please describe the role of the Planning Commission and that of a commissioner.
The role of the commissioner is to carry out the criteria that is set by the council. So when things are put before us, we look at the criteria. Does it meet the criteria? It's really implementing the policies of the city, which have been set by you as the city councilman.
And please describe your experience with land use and municipal planning, or how your experience is relevant to the role of the Planning Commission.
My experience comes with land use early In 1990, I lived in Idaho. I'd been elected to the city council there in Burley, Idaho. I don't take lightly you all running for office. I think it's the hardest job I ever took. I was really young then and probably shouldn't have, it was way over my head. But one of my jobs, or one of the assignments I had was to run the planning commission. We did a little differently in Idaho than we do here in Oregon. So that was my first taste in land use. When I moved here, I immediately applied to be on the planning commission when there was an opening. And so during that service, I just really enjoy the work. I just think it's perfect. I'm implementing what your policies are, but I'm still serving my community. So can you repeat the question? I think I left one part out.
It was just to describe your experience and how your experience is relevant to the role of the Planning Commission.
I think I've served on the commission, but I think that I do want to say that one of the most enjoyable times I had on the commission is when we combined the county and the city together when we were looking at the 20-year impact area. And that was really fun putting us together. And there was a couple of times I served with a couple of you already that we put our committees together and we listened to each other's committees. So I think all these things working together, I think I understand and I enjoy it immensely.
What specific skills would you bring to the commission?
Well, my skills have changed the older I've gotten. I'm now that I'm 62, I'm not very reactive. I'm pretty calm. I'm very prepared. I don't think I ever came into a meeting without reading the whole packet. And I'm a school teacher by trade. I'm a historian. So I feel really strongly that you have to know the packet. And I would be a little snippy if somebody on the commission had not read the packet. So I got a little school teachery there. But with that said, I just really, I think my skills, I served a year, I told you, in New York. I worked for the Broadway show Hamilton. I traveled around. And I think I thought I was going to do more teaching of teachers and students, but I ended up being the person that dealt with municipalities. And my tenure on the Planning Commission ended up being really invaluable. I was meeting with the Chicago Police Department, the mayor's office in New Orleans. We always worked in New York, which is really easy, but those other places, Detroit, that was tough. DC, we ran one at the Kennedy Center where I was dealing with different not just the municipality, but we had senators coming, so I was dealing with security. Pittsburgh was another really interesting municipal setup. So I think my time on the Planning Commission really honed my skills to understand how a city works and how to go through the channels. And apparently I found out I'm pretty good at logistics, but I still think that goes back to all the looking at the details in the packets year after year, meeting after meeting. So I think I have those. I didn't know I had those skills, by the way. So, but I think that they're in some of the planning meetings, especially when it came to moving boundaries, especially the growth area. I learned how to deal with conflict too, and I think I'm really good at dealing with conflict, especially when I became chairman. And the other thing I am, when I was chairman, I really wanted everybody to have their say. The commissions I've worked on or served on, I had some of the very best, some of them sitting in front of me, but very best people. I was fortunate enough to be with Bob Bean. I don't know if you remember him way back in the day, but he really taught you how to come into a meeting, how to be prepared, how not to be reactive, and to really listen to every citizen that spoke before you. I think it's really hard for a citizen to come up and speak to you. And they're nervous. So one of my jobs as a commissioner, whether it was chairman, vice chairman, or just a regular commissioner, was to make our citizens feel very comfortable in coming and saying their opinion. And it was our job to really listen and also to somewhat educate, to understand that we are always held to that criteria that you set.
Thank you. That sets up the next question. Should planning code always be followed?
Yes. I'm going to be really, I mean, there has been planning code that when we were looking at it way back in the day, you might have been involved, Counselor, but we were talking about signs, and we didn't have really good sign code, and we needed laws changed. So I think that the Planning Commission, another thing that does for you is that we see what needs to be changed beforehand. The other one was cell phone towers. We heard a lot of stuff on that. So I think it's our job to kind of look at that kind of stuff. But I am absolutely adamant that I'm hemmed in by what you guys set as criteria. If the criteria needs to change, that's your job, and my input can come that way. I certainly, over my tenure, which was well over, I think it was well over 20 years because I'm older now, but I spoke before the city council when we wanted to change something, but it wasn't done at the commission. So, and even just casual conversations of tweaking one little thing here or there that would have made it easier for us to pass something that came before us, but it wasn't, it was violating the criteria at that point. And Bob Bean taught me how to also, not massage, but to look at it with a different light. When I first came on the commission, I was looking at things way too black and white. And he showed within the criteria where the gray is. So I think that I kind of carried on that tradition too. But you guys are the elected official. I'm appointed, and I am very clear on that line.
Thank you. The Planning Commission meetings are scheduled for the second and fourth Wednesdays of each month in the evening. Are you able to meet this time commitment for both those meetings and any other city required functions? And are you available and willing to prepare adequately for each meeting?
Yes.
All right. Council, do you have any follow-up questions? Rick?
Thank you, Lois. Sorry I didn't recognize you before. It's been a while. What challenges do you see happening in the future that the Planning Commission will need to address?
It just depends on where development goes. I mean, the biggest, I think you guys solved the one with the water. The water treatment was a big deal for a while. It is very clear in this, and you are setting the criteria, so I don't want to act like I'm setting criteria or anything, but the lack of housing, rentals, that kind of stuff is just, my son lives here, my daughter-in-law, my 2 grandkids, 2 of the 4 that I have, and there just isn't any place to rent. So that's something you face. I don't think we can do anything on the Planning Commission. We can't build housing for by any means, but I think that's the bigger issue right now, and you guys probably heard that when you ran for office.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any additional questions? Nope. All right.
Oh,
go ahead.
I
Val.
always want to do one. You know how that goes. But
Well,
you've
you're a
answered.
school teacher.
Yes, I know, exactly. And you have answered many of the questions that I would have asked. If you are selected as a planning commissioner, what are your goals you would like to accomplish? So what do you see as, if there's anything that you would really like to see done within our city? It kind of goes back to...
I really don't have any. I just really enjoyed serving. I think that some of the things with the water treatment, the impact area, when we put our way back in the day, we put the county planning and the urban area planning commission together and made those decisions together. I thought that was really, really fun stuff. I don't really have a goal other than to serve.
Thank you. Any additional questions? All right. Thank you for being here today, Lois, and for applying for this position. We'll be
Thank you.
scheduled to make a decision on Wednesday, and we'll get back to you either way.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right. And next up is, find where I set, Lloyd Ward, I believe. I've misplaced where there we go. Hello, welcome. Please step up to the podium there. The mic should be on.
It's on.
I will be asking you a few questions, and then if the council has any follow-up questions, they will do that as well. First up, why would you like to join the Planning Commission?
Well, I figure I might as well. I'm still on it.
All right, and please describe the role of the Planning Commission and that of a commissioner.
The Planning Commission is there to provide information on land changes or with people coming in for requests for variances on properties that they might want to work on, so that the county or the city council, I'm sorry, I used to be a county council member, so city council has a voice that hears these issues and then can be assured that they're being addressed in public fashion, in an open fashion, so that takes a load off your plate.
Thank you. Please describe your experience with land use or municipal planning and how your experience is relevant to the role of the Planning Commission.
Well, my experience started years ago up in Bellingham, Washington. I was elected a council member up there in the county, and I served for 17 years. So I worked with a planning department as well as with other departments. We had our own committees that dealt with planning issues. And then the county had also a planning commission that was appointed by the council. So our relationship with our planning commission was always very good, and I learned a great deal of experiences can make a planning commission work well. So that's my experience, has been with the county as well as my relationship with the various departments.
Thank you. What specific skills would you bring to the commission?
Again, I was 17 years on a county council. I was the chairman of that council many times. I also served on other commissions and committees, as you people do here, I'm sure. So I had experiences with regional networks as well as other commissioners and council members from other communities. I worked with federal level with healthcare, because I'm a pharmacist. Recently now getting back into pharmacy in Oregon.
Thank you. Should planning code always be followed?
Should planning code always be followed? If it is written in law, then it should be. If it doesn't work, then we should address it. And that's where the Planning Commission can look at the code and make recommendations to you folks.
And my last question, the Planning Commission meetings are scheduled for second and fourth Wednesdays of the month in the evenings. Are you able to meet this time commitment?
Yes, I am.
Thank you. Council, any follow-up questions? Rick?
Thank you, Lloyd. So
You
what
can call me
challenges?
Ward. I go by my middle name.
Oh, okay, Ward. What challenges do you see in the future for the Planning Commission?
Well, that was one of the reasons I thought I'd join the commission 2 years ago, was I kept reading in the paper about the problem. I moved here 3 years ago with housing down here, and I think it's still a significant problem, as you folks have been trying to address that as well. And I think that's going to be our challenge, is how can we work with you people to make this a community where we do have fair housing and adequate housing. It looks like the governor is making it a priority of hers as well. So I think that's going to be our biggest challenge. I think transportation issues, particularly as the urban areas grow, as we try to develop those properties, is going to be a significant issue. My hopes is that we do good transportation planning, making sure that we not only meet our goals today, but those into the future.
Rob?
Yeah, thanks. So you were pretty clear that you feel that the code should always be followed. So I'm just wondering at what point or where do you think the word variance should fit into the commission's vocabulary, if at all?
Well, the variance is a method in which that we can evaluate code to see if it's effective in all situations. Just like every human body is different, we treat it differently. And that's where the variance comes in. It's sort of the medicine that we use to make sure that we're doing the right thing when we treat individual people when their requests come forward. It's a little different than the process we had up in Whatcom County, but I think it works down here as well.
Valerie?
Thank you, Ward, for being here. Describe how you would use the city's codes and other information to balance the rights of a property owner versus those of a neighbor or groups of people if you find they are in conflict. So,
Well, I think I look at it, it's like a courtroom. You're dealing with an individual, and you're there to take the minority's case and evaluate it. Now, neighbors may come in and testify. Fortunately, in the time I've been on there, I haven't seen a lot of neighborhoods upset about your code or variances that are being done. But it can become contentious at times, I know that. I know city councils face the same thing. So what you do is you try to evaluate in a very partisan, nonpartisan type fashion, not a partisan, and be a fair judge of the case itself, making sure that you're addressing the needs of the community, which would be reflected in the code, with that of the individual.
Joel?
My question was the same as Val's on the list, so thank you.
Oh, but you're welcome.
Any other questions? All right, thank you for being here today, Ward. And
Thank you.
we will be making a decision Wednesday and get back to you either way. Thanks for your time. All right. 4 good applicants to consider there, council. Next up, we have some interviews for our budget committee. And our first applicant is going to be Kurt Collins. Thanks for being here today, Kurt.
You know, this kind of feels like an intervention.
You couldn't get enough. All right, I have 5 questions here, and then we'll hand it off to the council if they would like to ask you any more questions. What is the role of the budget committee?
Budget committee is more or less a committee to take the presentation from staff of the budget and question it as a means of advisory for the council.
Thank you. And what prior work or voluntary experience have you had that would be helpful if you were appointed to this position?
All right. Stop me if you've heard this before. I was the Vice President of Sales and Marketing for Pacific Crest Transformers. So I was responsible for creating a $54 million budget, and I was also responsible for bringing in the revenue to cover that budget. I have served with the Budget Committee over 5 budget terms, and apparently I didn't learn my lesson.
Thank you. Please describe your skills or experiences that would benefit the Budget Committee.
Well, I guess I think I just did, but in my work career, I spent a lot of time dealing with public works in various communities, so I do have quite a bit of experience in that, have a different perspective on it. I've lived here in Grants Pass for 36 years full-time, and I've seen a lot of changes. Definitely have my opinions as to some of the things that have gone on here, so I believe I have a good life experience perspective.
What specific contributions do you hope to make?
Well, I don't have any delusions about the Budget Committee. It really doesn't impact the budget significantly. So, I mean, my main interest is really gaining the knowledge. I think every community member should observe the Budget Committee, particularly the people who want to write letters and send emails, because they should understand where the money comes from, what's dedicated to what purpose, before they make their critiques. And so with knowledge, I can speak about those things confidently.
Thank you. And the Budget Committee typically meets at least 4 times in May on Tuesdays and Thursday evenings. Additionally, throughout the year, there may be a special meeting, typically on a Wednesday. Your attendance could be beneficial. Are you able to make such a time commitment?
Well, as I said, I've been through 5 budget seasons and I haven't missed one yet, so I don't expect it to be a problem.
Thank you. Council, do you have any follow-up questions? Vanessa?
Thank you for being here today and applying. The expectation of Budget Committee members is that they do their homework prior to meetings by familiarizing yourself with the allocation of resources and the strategic plan. How do you feel about this expectation?
I would expect of anybody else on the committee. I believe that my experience with council, again, has made me more fully armed to do that and have a clearer understanding of what we're discussing at each evening, so I have no problem with that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Rob?
Oh, yeah. Oh.
Yeah, thanks, Kurt. So is there anything in particular you feel your experience on council will basically, how does your experience on council, how will it help you on the budget committee, specifically anything you learned as a counselor?
Well, I think I just have a fuller understanding of all of the different demands on the budget, and I just think that that gives me a much better way to analyze what goes on and to take a look at the budget.
Thank you. Val?
Yeah. Nice to see you, Curtis. What is the most important financial issue facing the city, and why do you think it's important? And what other financial issues face our city, and why are they important? So what are the financial things that you see, having been involved with the council, as most pressing right now?
Public safety, full stop.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, thanks for being here today, Kurt. We are scheduled to make an appointment on Wednesday evening, and we will get back to you either way.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for applying. And next up is going to be Tom Brandis. Welcome. Step on up to the mic, please. We are interviewing candidates for Budget Committee. I have 5 questions that I will ask, and then if council wants to follow up with any additional questions, they may do that. So first up, what is the role of Budget Committee?
What is the role of Budget Committee?
Yes.
Well, it gets the original document that will be the budget after it's gone through the Budget Committee and been scrutinized carefully. And then that ultimately will go to the staff, well, to the City Council for final approval in in June.
Okay, and what prior work or volunteer experience have you had that would be helpful if you're appointed to this position?
Well, I've been on the Budget Committee for, I believe, 7 years.
All right, please describe your skills that would benefit the committee.
My skills, I guess I can parse through things and make them make sense, but I mean, I'm not a CPA or something.
What specific contributions do you hope to make?
Well, I'll do my best to make sure that what comes out of the committee is accurate and reflects people having gone over it carefully.
And as you know, the Budget Committee typically meets at least 4 times in May on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Additionally, throughout the year, there may be a special meeting at which your attendance could be beneficial. Are you able to make such a time commitment?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. Council, follow-up. Rob?
Thanks, Tom. So you've been on the Budget Committee 7 years. Could you describe how your perspective now compared to what it was year one? In other words, what, if anything, have you learned in the last 7 years?
I don't feel totally underwater on everything that comes, which is about the way it was when you start. I think a former city councilor talked about it's like drinking out of a fire hose when you start. So now I understand more things and more comfortable with a lot more things than I was when I started.
Valerie?
Yes, hi Tom, good to
Hi.
see you. What is the most important financial issue facing our city and why do you think it's important? And are there other financial issues facing our city that you can see coming up?
The revenue side is short of where we'd like it to be. And it's very difficult to find revenue, and various things that have been tried in the city or the county are difficult to pass. People want things, but they don't want to necessarily pay for them.
Thank
Rick?
you for understanding.
Rick?
Thank you, Tom. Valerie pretty much asked my question, but I'll just change it a little bit. Do you see there's a major issue that the county budget faces in the future?
Do I see the county budget?
No, excuse me. Do you see there's a major issue that the city is facing on the budget in the future?
I hope not. I can't foresee it. I mean, obviously, there's things that are large that are out there, like water filtration plants and things like this, and that's an ongoing concern. It's going to be for 20 years.
Thank you.
Any additional questions? All right, thank you for being here today, Tom, as well as for your past service. And we will be making appointments Wednesday evening, and we will get back to you one way or the other.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for being here. All right. Next, we have Nicholas Teston. Hi, Nicholas, welcome. Thank you for being here today. We have a few questions that I'm going to ask, and then afterwards the council may ask you some follow-up questions as well.
Okay.
Can you please describe the role of the Budget Committee?
Yes, it's to get a maintained budget for a balanced budget for the community, and budget for the community.
Thank you. What prior work or volunteer experience have you had that would be helpful if you were appointed to this position?
What prior? Mm-hmm. I haven't really had any prior volunteer experience. I helped my dad a lot, hauling like scrap metal and landscaping, house painting, and selling firewood and stuff like that.
Thank you. Please describe your skills that would benefit the committee.
I'm a good listener, I'm punctual and on time, I'm a good reader, a good writer, I'm good with math, and stuff like that.
Thank you. What specific contributions do you hope to make?
To give back to the community.
Thank you. The Budget Committee typically meets at least 4 times in May on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Additionally, there may be a special meeting throughout the year, typically on a Wednesday. Right. Are you able to make such a time commitment?
Yes.
Thank you. Council, do you have any follow-up questions? Valerie?
Okay, what is the most important financial issue you think is facing the city, and why is it important?
The police department.
Are there any other issues that you want to add? Or
The homelessness crisis.
Thank you, Nicholas.
Thank you.
Any additional questions? All right, thank you for your time today and for applying for this position. We'll be making a decision on Wednesday night, and then we'll send you a letter letting you know either way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You have a good day.
Yeah, enjoy that sunshine. All right, that concludes our interviews for the morning. It's now afternoon. Let's move on to housing production strategy.
All right. And I'm going to have Beth share her screen, so she'll be up on the screen. Beth Goodman is our consultant with Eco Northwest, who has been guiding the city through our housing production strategy journey. She has been excellent, her and her assistant, Nicole. And yeah, I'll have Beth take it away.
Thank you so much, Amber. I'm going to share my screen now. Give me one moment. So do you all see my PowerPoint up on the screen?
Not currently. We do have it back up if we can't get it up, but we don't see it yet.
All right, it's just taking a moment. So it says it's presenting. And you're still not seeing it, it sounds like.
Nope.
All right, I'm going to unshare it and then reshare it. And then if that doesn't work, then I will ask you to put the PowerPoint on your screen.
Sounds good.
And are you seeing it now?
We are not.
Oh, that's very interesting. I'm sorry. Could you go ahead and put it up on your screen, and I'll just tell you when to advance the slides?
Yes, I can. Are you able to see it on mine?
No. What I'm seeing mostly is Karen, I'm kind of wondering if there's a little something that needs to change on how what Teams is displaying.
How about now?
There we go. Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Okay, we're going to go ahead on into this. Next slide, please. So we've been working on the housing production strategy for the last year, and Grants, of course, has been working on this issue for a lot more time than that. So what we're here to do today is get your comments and questions and the actions in the HPS, which we intend to incorporate into the HPS document. Housing Production Strategy is the HPS, which I believe that you have a copy of that in front of you. We want to share information about things like funding sources and partners who would support implementation of the Housing Production Strategy actions and discuss the adoption schedule. And in the end, what we're looking for from this discussion is whether there's any remaining questions or considerations before we finalize the housing production strategy. So we've been working with the housing committee and the subcommittee over the last few months on understanding Grants Pass housing needs in more detail, developing the strategies that would address those unmet housing needs, doing some evaluation on those strategies. And here we are at the last piece. Could you advance the slide? I'm sorry. Here we are at the last step here of putting it all together in a housing production strategy. Next slide. another way to represent what our schedule has been is here. And next slide, please. So this slide summarizes the involvement of various stakeholder groups. So first and foremost, we've had our Housing Advisory Committee, and we've had the Housing Production Strategy Subcommittee, which is the subcommittee of the Advisory Committee. And you can see the dates that we've met with them and walked through each of the strategies and discussed whether they were the right strategies, whether we were missing any strategies, and got help in providing more detail about what the city would do potentially and would hope to accomplish within the strategies. Last year, we had an open house that was kicked off the project essentially to discuss unmet housing needs. This last summer, we did some focus groups with affordable housing developers, local housing developers and builders, and then different providers of services for vulnerable populations to preview the strategies with them and get feedback from them on anything that we were missing. And then, of course, we've been in front of the Planning Commission and the City Council on the dates that are shown there. So all of this has been a way of saying that the housing production strategy document that you have is essentially built on a great deal of feedback from these different groups. Before I move on to talk about the substance of the strategy, are there any questions?
Not seeing any.
Okay, thank you. Okay, on the next slide, please. So first and foremost, if you'll go to the next slide. There we go, thank you. What is Grants Pass doing when it adopts a housing production strategy? What's it agreeing to? These responsibilities and reporting requirements, et cetera, are all documented in the administrative rule, Division 8. So this is just a summary out of there. But for the strategies that are in the housing production strategy, the city is essentially committing to try good faith effort at implementation of each of the strategies. I think it is known and increasingly acknowledged by the state, by the Department of Land Conservation and Development, that housing production strategies are going to have to change. This is an 8-year action plan. The world is going to change over the next 8 years. So it may be that one or more actions that we've got in the housing production strategy just won't work out. So you'll attempt to implement it and find for whatever reason it's not the right strategy. It's not the right action. And so the city would go back and replace that with some other action if needed. So then you're also required to update the state, the Department of Land Conservation and Development, DLCD, on implementation progress, and then comment on the effectiveness of the housing production strategy in the future. And so that means that monitoring of the outcomes of the housing production strategy are important. And so there are some actions, some strategies that are not in the HPS that could still be implemented by the city, but the city is not held to specific action by the state. We've got a number of recommendations that I think fall into that category. There's a lot of consideration and discussion among staff and consultants about what the right number of actions are, because the city only has so much capacity for doing complex actions each year. We didn't want to load the city down with 30 or 40 actions that can't reasonably be accomplished over the next 8 years. But there are some things that might well, that we can see now that might well be accomplished. We'll talk about those last. Before I go on, are there questions specifically about the requirements for the city?
Not at this time, thank you.
Sure. Okay, so on this slide, what we're showing you is all of the actions that we have in the housing production strategy. What I intend to do is walk through each of some of the details on each of the ones highlighted in red. And if there are other questions that you have about other actions, I'm happy to talk about them, but let's maybe walk through the ones highlighted in red first, and then follow up with any other questions. So next slide, please. So one of the key actions is about developing a program to support homeownership. Supporting homeownership is particularly difficult in a lot of different ways because it can be very expensive. So barriers to homeownership are things like needing to have a down payment, having a poor credit score and restricting, which restricts the household's ability to obtain a mortgage, not enough housing being developed and for sale relative to demand, lack of affordable homeownership opportunities in general. So housing is just too expensive, and we see that in Grants Pass and in a lot of other communities. Some of these things the city can't really affect, like poor credit scores, but some of these things the city can have impact on. So the key pieces in this strategy are about down payment assistance potentially. The city already does some down payment assistance through a little bit of the construction excise tax funds that go back to the state. 15% of the construction excise tax funds go back to the state and then come back to the community via the Oregon Housing and Community Services Department, and that's via down payment assistance. So the city could look at doing additional down payment assistance if there was funds to support that, and there could be in certain areas funds to support that. The city could also support provide financial support through paying down interest rates, because obviously interest rates have gotten a lot higher than they were a year or two ago, which very much affects ability to purchase a home. And then there's also the possibility of support for Community Land Trust. So Community Land Trust is an organization that its purpose is to build housing and make sure that it is affordable over the long term, so affordable beyond the first sale. And so the city could partner with a land trust if one existed, because one doesn't exist that's building new housing in Grants Pass right now. And the city could provide things like technical assistance and planning assistance as the land trust was trying to build new housing. It could also provide financial assistance, possibly in the form of land. So one of our other actions is evaluating opportunities for dedicating surplus land, surplus city lots for affordable housing development. A lot of land that's surplus in the city at this point that the city owns is destined for parks and open space. But it could be that at some point there's an opportunity to use some city-owned surplus land for housing development, and that's when you could look at working with a land trust, for instance, a community land trust. So there's a lot of different ways to do this one. This depends, at least in part, on having funding and what the city does beyond what it's doing currently with its construction excise tax. Are there any questions on this one?
No.
No. All right, let's go to the next one. So this one goes straight to your planning commission discussions, increasing density to support affordable housing. So some of the city's existing development standards are probably driving down achievable densities. Specifically, the development code requires that 30% of the gross lot for multi-unit developments be dedicated to open space. That's a lot larger share of the lot than in a lot of other communities. So for instance, Ashland requires 8% for public open space. Hood River has a smaller requirement at all. And so the outcome of this is that you can build less housing on that parcel of land because so much of it is used for open space. You of course also have to accommodate things like your parking requirements, et cetera, on that land. Your solar setback standards may also need to be looked at, evaluated for whether you could decrease them or change them in a way that allows you to achieve a little bit higher densities. So it's not about changing the densities in your code right now. It's about changing some of the other standards that let development get closer to those densities. And then once you've dealt with that, you might also look at, is there an opportunity to develop a density bonus that would allow developers to build at higher densities than are usually allowed in your underlying zone in selected instances. So for instance, if you were looking at development of multi-unit housing that was comparatively affordable, say affordable to a household with income below average in the community, then you might offer a density bonus that gave density beyond that. And there's a lot of different ways to look at implementing a density bonus. So permitting a larger number of units in a building or on a development site, allowing smaller lot sizes, giving a height bonus for slightly higher buildings, reducing your open space requirements, changing your parking space requirements that might be appropriate in cases where the residents of that multi-unit development are less likely to drive. So for instance, senior housing, you may have fewer people in that development who drive, especially if it's in an area where people can walk to services or have access to transit. So those are some of the options for increasing densities. One of them would apply to all housing, and the other, if the city chose to adopt a density bonus, might apply to housing in a specific area and or housing that's comparatively affordable. The city would set what its requirements were for the density bonus. Are there any questions about that? Okay.
No, thank you.
Oh, thank you. All right, so then on to the next one. The city has an existing system development charge waiver program, and it's used theoretically to promote affordable housing development, but the city hasn't seen much uptake on this. So some of the question is why? What is not working for developers? Why aren't they using it? So should the city expand its waiver program to include waivers for high density, market rate, multi-unit development in predetermined areas? So in, say, urban renewal, your urban renewal district. And if you offer system development waivers, you have to backfill the lost revenue from a system development waiver through some other mechanism. Urban renewal is one of the ways to do it. Construction excise tax is another way that the city could backfill those lost funds. But our advice here is really about targeting the type of multi-unit development that the city is looking for. This would be almost certainly rental housing. So that you get an agreement for comparatively affordable housing in exchange for some waiver of some amount of your system development charge. So I think the first step in this really is engaging the development community, both for affordable housing and for market rate housing, to understand what's not working and what could work better, and then identifying how you're going to backfill the foregone system development charge revenues. Are there any questions there?
Yes, there is. Go ahead, Rick.
So in the first sentence, simplify the program for removing requirements for income verification. Could that be a recipe for failure? Because previously, when mortgages were issued without scrutiny on income, then later on it had a very adverse effect on the economy. How does that apply here?
No, this is something that's pretty different than that. So income verification is, and this is about rental housing, not ownership housing. Income verification is verifying that the people living in the housing qualify as, in some cases, as low income or moderate income. So in other words, you're making sure that this housing unit that is made available and let's say it's affordable at 80%, affordable to a household that earns 80% of median family income. And let's just make up a number. I apologize, I don't remember that number in my head right now, but let's say that's $1,500 a month in rent. That house, that apartment rather, is being rented to a household that has income that qualifies for that. So it's not a high income household. So you're not renting that $1,500 a month unit to a household who could really afford $2,500 a month, for instance. So that's the income verification there. That's what that's about. It's not about what we had happening back in 2010. It's very different.
Okay. So in that aspect then, if somebody had a substantial income, but they wanted to occupy an apartment that was low rent, is there protection for that for the person that maybe should not be in that apartment would be excluded because they have too high an income?
And that's part of what you have to work out, how you would do income verification. So you may not have the same requirements for income verification as you have quite now, but you may have some other requirements for income. I think this is really very much in how the city wants to structure this.
Thank you.
Yeah. Essentially, you don't want to give away things and get nothing back and nothing back for it, is what I'm saying.
And this is Valerie. I just have a question on that because it seems to me most of those are state and federal things, so that the city wouldn't be able to adjust those. Am I correct? Or that doesn't seem like that's something that the city can actually change, because it seems like most of those requirements come from the federal and the state.
So that is for housing that is affordable below 60% of median family income. If the city was choosing to give system development charge waivers for housing that was affordable at that level and it had federal and state money in it, then it would automatically come with income verification, because those programs already require that the developers do income verification. What we're saying here is that you're just not seeing much uptake on this program from your low-income, affordable housing development. Might you want to expand it to your moderate-income, affordable housing developers? So those who are developing above 60% of median family income. So it's not just the federal and state-funded housing; it's also privately developed market rate multi-unit housing.
Okay.
This is a particularly complicated issue that the city would have to work through.
And Beth, do you mind if I expand on that a little bit?
Please do.
So part of the thought behind this one was that ideally, eventually the SDC or the CET could take over our existing affordable SDC waiver program, and that the monies that we get from the sale of surplus land could be dedicated to a high density focused program, because that's money that the city controls and can set their own parameters. Another idea was to pull some of the money out of the affordable project in the urban renewal area and put it to market rate housing. Since we have such an increase now in our affordable housing, being able to separate it to market rate would be a good idea to get more density in the city.
So you're saying basically that would be like a density bonus, basically, in a sense, to more of a market rate above the 60%. So workforce housing and that sort of housing, we could do that.
Correct.
Ourselves. Okay, thank you.
It's not exactly a density bonus, but it's in supporting development of denser housing types. That is, as you said, workforce housing. Are there any other questions on this?
No, it looks like we can move on.
Okay, so moving on to the next one. Expand funding and outreach for rehabilitation of existing low-cost, unregulated, affordable housing. So what we're talking about here is housing that is going to be mostly owner-occupied by households that have comparatively low income. And so what happens in a lot of cases is your housing, it has deferred maintenance issues on it because a household may not have enough resources to make the improvements and pay for the repairs. So it could be things like a roof problem, a roof needing to be replaced, foundation problems, electrical problems. You could also think about things like weatherization sorts of issues, so windows, all of that. You have an existing rehabilitation program that's funded through the Community Development Block Grant funds. And so what we're talking about here is expanding grants to property owners for repairs and major rehabilitation, providing that existing residents aren't displaced. So for instance, you may want this for homeowners who have income below 80% of median family income. The city could also do things like look at what its regulatory requirements are, permitting requirements are for improvements to older houses. Is there some way that they could be made simpler and less expensive to comply with? Is there information or technical assistance that the city can provide for rehabilitation? Looking at, there's an additional funding source, which I only recently became aware of, the Oregon Health Authority's Healthy Housing Grant Program. It's a new grant program that's not in place right now, but its intention is for grants to do just about exactly this. And the city could apply for a grant from that program and use that funding perhaps similarly to the way it uses its existing CDBG funds. So that this is, look for money essentially to expand your existing program and look at ways to expand the existing program. So this is an anti-displacement and another support for homeownership.
We have a question back. Rick,
Yes.
go ahead.
So while my question's not specifically on single-family dwelling, to the statements in there, including expanding existing retrofitting program and reducing regulatory challenges to older housing, we in the city of Grants Pass have second-story situations that could be used for housing, but the building code requiring sprinklers and other items doesn't pencil. So is there any way there would be grants out there for that or exemptions that you would be aware of in the building code that would allow that to occur at a lesser expense?
I haven't specifically looked for grants for that. There may be, and I'm not a building code expert, but I would assume that there's not exemptions in the building code because it tends to be a little bit more rigid. This may be something that Amber may know something about also.
I'm not an expert on the urban renewal funds, but I would think that might fall under them.
Yeah. Urban renewal funds could possibly be used for this, depending on what's in your urban renewal plan. I don't know how much existing, well, second floor housing would be a little more likely to be in an urban renewal district, yeah. That could be another direction to go with this.
Thank you.
Are there other questions?
No.
So Amber, could we go back to slide 8, the summary of actions and goals? So back about 3 or 4 slides. Were there any questions on other actions that folks wanted to talk about?
Yeah, I just had a question regarding prioritization because I see each of these categories. There's like potential impact, potential complexity, flexibility, and so is the final report going to give us, I know that there's a timeline in there, so I would assume that maybe that is the prioritization that has been given, and if so, is that something that city staff has already looked at and something that's realistic from a staff perspective?
Can I defer that question until a few slides from now when we get to the timeline?
Absolutely.
Prioritization and the timeline aren't exactly the same thing, but they're pretty closely related. Any other questions about the actions before we go on?
Yes, Aaron.
So thank you for the report. This is Aaron Kubik, City Manager. And so far taking a look at the actions. So I'm looking at this process as doing yard work. Now I've got a front yard that hasn't been touched for quite a while and it's in disrepair. And so I need to do a lot of landscaping. And greatly appreciate the suggested actions that are here in this plan. And I relate these as the majority of these that we've talked about today right now are highlighted as impact for development as small to moderate.
Yep.
So I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to go out and I'm going to tackle my front yard and I'm going to take the tools that I've been presented to me today, and that is a pruning shear because that's a small and moderate tool. And I'm going to go out and I'm going to start pruning with my pruning shears, tree branches, grass, whatever it is that's necessary. And I'm going to end up with carpal tunnel at the end of the day and only being able to utilize about fixing about an eighth of my yard. So I'm curious, are there tools that are in the moderate to high category that we can highlight today to where I'd be getting out my chainsaw or my hedge trimmers or my lawnmower and things that we can have larger impact that council can discuss today and highlight that is going to be in the action plan to where we can make a bigger impact for the city's contributions?
So all of these things layer on top of each other for the most part. The actions that have the largest impact are rezoning land for housing, action A. That is going comparatively slowly because of funding. That there's not a lot of funding available. And then the other action that can have I would say the largest impact in a lot of ways is urban renewal. So can we go down to slide 13? So answering your question really becomes a matter, thank you, of money. How much money does the city have? Money or it could also be in the form of if the city had a big chunk of land available for housing development, which I don't believe it does. The answer becomes, do you have money or land to support a lot more housing development? And the sources of funds are relatively limited. So urban renewal, it's an important source of funds for housing development potentially, and also for infrastructure development, but that only applies to the urban renewal district. Your CET funding, to the extent that depending on how much funds you have in it, that's also an important thing. ARPA funds have been very important. And then of course, what's going to come out of your state and federal funding, it's not clear to me exactly what's going to come out of this next biennium, but I expect some funding to come out of it. And so looking at those state and federal grants, your private donations and gifts is likely to be relatively small. It's not like the city is going to act as do fundraising as a charity, I would imagine. Those kind of things tend to be very staff intensive. So your next potential sources of funding are things like a general obligation bond or a new option levy. They also all require a voter approval, and we've just listed them as unlikely to pass voter approval. But if you wanted to make bold action, I would say that a general obligation bond is the best way to make bold action. And that would be, I hate to use the term mower because that's a terrible thing to, vision. But that would be the thing to help you get the most housing developed. Honestly, it's about how much funding you have to bring to this. You have some staff time, so you've got Amber doing the work that she does, which a lot of cities don't have that staff capacity. So you have some of that, but funding becomes really the big barrier. That's a really unsatisfying answer, I know.
So as a follow-up to that, that sort of highlights one of the things I was trying to address, and that is limited resources. And by providing a lot of options that are small to moderate, and us spending our limited resources on all the small to moderates, would it be more effective and efficient for us to pool whatever resources we have to hit on one of the large to moderate, or one or two of the large to moderates, even if it does require some of the revenue sources that you discussed. One of the things I'm concerned with is we have a very active policy board that wants to have action and see results. We have a community that wants to see results. And if we're spending a lot of time on small to moderate, there might not be a lot of visual change in our front yard landscape. Where if we go ahead and we purchase or we rent a tool that's going to be able to provide us with a large visual and true impact to that landscaping we need to do, that could show one additional community pride, spirit, and momentum that may not be seen if we focus on small to moderate. So if there's an opportunity through this plan process for us to focus on and really prioritize, even if resources don't have resource funding as the biggest obstacle, but let's take a look at what has the biggest impact, I would think might be helpful for council, because then we might be able to pull resources and try and look what might be best for the community and build momentum.
So the items that are most likely to have the larger, also realize that a number of these do layer on top of each other. And so if you make the density changes that we talked about in item E, and you implement a multi-unit limited tax exemption, which is item G, and you look at your system development waiver chart program, those three taken together, they could result in, the moderate, maybe even a little bit larger impact on development, especially if you put some of that into your urban renewal district. So some of this becomes about finding the community finding the community partners that you need to be working with, whether they're multifamily, multi-unit developers that are market rate, or your low-income housing developers, your income-restricted housing developers, or both, preferably. And understanding as you're working with them on how to shape a couple of these key policies, and then getting some development agreements going. In other words, where they're at a point where they can start making new development proposals. If the city had land for affordable housing development, so for instance, Hood River, they went and they used a lot of their CET to purchase quite a few acres in the community that was vacant, and they put an RFP out for an affordable housing development that would be mixed income, so lower income as well as market rate housing. Over time, that's going to have a very noticeable impact in their community. So it's about getting the incentives right, and a package of incentives that are right, and then having the developers who have the interest in doing the development, willingness to doing the development, and can get financing for doing the development. So all of those things have to work together. From what I understand from some of our key economists, they're seeing, because of some of the changes in interest rates, that multifamily development that's not financed yet will have a little difficulty getting financing, a lot of difficulty getting financing in the next year or two until some of the finance markets change. So it may well be that you have some time to begin to implement these different measures before the finance markets change again and make it more favorable. So shall we go on to look at, maybe skip over partnerships for a moment and go on to look at the implementation schedule? Because it could be that we have some of the implementation schedule a little bit off, and we can talk about revising that. That schedule is based on the feedback that we heard from city staff about capacity.
That sounds good. Thank you.
Certainly. So rezoning land for housing, I think that's going to be your biggest impact. And to the extent that the city can do that quicker, we've got it going out through 2030 because I believe that that is the current estimates of how long it's going to take, given existing funding, to do the transportation studies that are necessary. So to the extent that that could be done more quickly or in strategic areas, in other words, do areas that'll have a bigger impact, will show off your front yard better sooner, then I think that's a key one to get done as soon as you can. Then things like your outreach to promote affordable housing development, housing access, all of that would be ongoing throughout the whole period. And then looking at items C through E, which are some of them related to each other potentially, and are the ones that I would suggest getting done soonest. So we've got your density, your SDC waivers and your 2 different tax exemptions for considerations of those out a little bit longer. And I think that's a staff capacity issue. So it's going to take time to work through each of these. These are all things that I think are going to need city council input. And then rehabilitation and let's see, development of a resource center for people experiencing homelessness. That's just a couple of years out. Urban renewal funding, that's going to take some time to accumulate. There's some refinement that needs to happen with how to spend urban renewal funding. There's nothing, it's not that there will be nothing going on there between 2024 and 2027, but it's that it may well take some time to have enough funds for something to be going on. So that's the current thinking about the implementation schedule. And it may well be that you have feedback on a different schedule on changing some of this.
Dwayne?
Yeah, number E. We already have one in Josephine, Jackson County for number E. I mean, we can give them money to go ahead and do that program, help with their programming. That's an access. I don't understand why we have to reinvent the wheel when we already have that program in Josephine and Jackson County.
You're talking about increasing densities to support affordable housing development?
I think that's one where you can give help people that buy houses. Numbers, I can't remember.
So that's part of item D.
Yeah, number D. We already have that program. It's in Josephine, Jackson County.
So it could be, then it's about making the, so with access, making the relationship and making sure that access is interested in participating in that, and then providing them with funding for that. And perhaps that doesn't take all of the rest of 2023, and that might be something that's done earlier than is in this schedule.
Yeah, that could be really soon.
Mm-hmm. And so the idea with this schedule, just so you know, the reason that it doesn't list specific dates is that the city is required to report on implementation of all of these things if implementation doesn't happen by the last day of the year, essentially, is what we're saying. So implementation can happen earlier, and there's no problem with that. But if the city hasn't implemented by the last day of the year for the years that we've specified here, then the city has to report to the state why not. And so we're attempting to give flexibility here and not put the city in a position where it's constantly reporting to the state.
Any other questions? Vanessa?
I did have a question about item J, support development of a resource center for people experiencing homelessness. And I did read in the draft report that the discussion that the city has been working for some time on allocating the DAS funds. We know that there is an expiration date approaching with those, so I was curious on the implementation schedule for this item. We know we're coming up against that hard stop, so I was curious on the 2026 implementation.
And I would have to defer to staff on that. I just don't know the details of when those funds have to be spent. And that may be something that we want to take back and consider again.
So setting that timeline is just to give us some extra wiggle room. There's always the possibility that the DAS funds don't get spent on that specific item, so we might need to explore alternative options and giving us a little bit extra wiggle room. Again, if we get it completed, say this year, then excellent, nothing wrong with that. But this does give us wiggle room if our plan A falls through, that we have time to find a plan B before having to report that we were not able to accomplish that in time.
Thank you.
Joel?
Well, and if it makes sense on any of those items, if we get them done ahead of time, it doesn't foreclose that option either. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yep. Doing things ahead of time is perfectly fine.
Number I.
And so you might have this implementation schedule in your HPS and then a working implementation schedule that's a little different.
No, number I up there, we currently have that program, don't we, right now? 'Cause I just went out with them on Friday.
Yeah, so this is talking about potentially expanding that program and adding to it.
So there's at
gonna
least
wait 2
one new
years.
source of funding from the state.
Yeah, there was a grant that Beth had referenced that we could potentially apply for and add new funding to that.
I just don't understand why it takes 2 years to,
Again, it doesn't have to, that just gives us the wiggle room
I mean,
to
we
do
need
it.
things done today, not 2 years from now. I just don't understand why this is such a
Well-
long plan on so many stuff.
That particular grant funding source isn't actually available yet. And it may not be available for application until sometime in 2024. So some of these you might think of as the city will do what it can do in the short term, and there may be longer term things that need to happen. So I don't think that all of these are necessarily one and done. Some of them are. But that's an example of where if you find more funding, then you can use it more in your existing program.
That's all the hands I see, Beth.
Okay. Then let's go on to the next slide. This is just an example of the monitoring suggestions that we've got in the HPS. So again, in 8 years, when you're required to do this again, you're going to be required to comment on the effectiveness. And frankly, I would imagine that the City Council will want to know what the effectiveness of these different actions are. So here are some examples. So in rezoning land for housing, maybe you have an annual monitoring report that reports how many acres of land were rezoned for by zoning district, how many acres of land were annexed, and then maybe that is connected in your overall monitoring to number of units developed by type of housing, and you may be able to report that for housing for land that's been rezoned that was brought into the UGB a few years ago. So there's opportunities and I think some requirement to do a fair bit of monitoring. It's just you want to choose monitoring metrics that are monitoring the outcomes you're looking for. And then if we go on to the next slide, there's a number of recommendations that aren't actions here. So about maintaining your advisory group, they could have an active role in implementing this plan. So in other words, rather than having to appoint some other advisory group that doesn't know as much about housing, your existing housing advisory group could have an active role. Of course, there's the broad recommendation to connect economic development efforts closely with housing planning, because housing affordability problem, the flip side to it is about having enough jobs that are relatively higher paying. On manufactured home parks and preserving them, what that is that's a recommendation about when manufactured home parks, it starts to be known that they are coming up for sale, making sure that the people who live in the parks know that that park is up for sale, and then potentially connecting those residents with some of the nonprofits across the state who have been helping residents buy manufactured home parks. The city could also implement a zone that is a manufactured home park zone that would not allow any development that wasn't manufactured home parks in the home park. So in other words, they'd have to, the owners would have to apply for rezoning before something else could be built. Your existing housing that is income restricted, so it's got federal and state funds, some of that is likely to expire. Some of those low-income housing tax credits may expire over the next 8 years. The state tracks that. City staff have access to the state tracking of that. So this is just a recommendation about be aware of that, so that as low-income housing tax credits come up for expiration, there can be discussions with the owners of the building about whether their intention is to sell the building and have it no longer be income restricted housing, or if they want to recapitalize the building with new low-income housing tax credits. That's something the state is tracking pretty closely. So having staff aware of that is helpful. Next slide. So the first one about providing off-site infrastructure to support new affordable housing development, that is most likely to occur without any extra effort in the urban renewal zone. But where you're thinking about affordable housing, be it workforce affordable or income restricted, looking at are there opportunities for the city to support that development by paying for, partially or in whole, infrastructure that's necessary for that. The next recommendation is to, when you next evaluate your system development charge methodology, consider scaling your system development charge based on unit size to allow smaller units to pay a lower system development charge with the idea of having smaller, more entry-level housing costs for smaller homes. So in other words, your big homes pay a larger system development charge, your smaller homes pay less. The next one is about providing incentives in the development code to increase the number of accessible units through meeting things like the universal design, lifelong housing certification, other sorts of standards. This wasn't something that rose to the level of putting in an action, but there's probably some incentives that the city could implement to support that, and that's for housing that's primarily for people with disabilities and people who are aging. And then the shoot the moon recommendation of issue a general obligation bond to support housing and infrastructure development. Honestly, I think that that's unlikely over this next 8 years, given how difficult it's been to support any bond in this part of Southern Oregon, but it is certainly an option. And that's what's in your HPS. Are there more questions or comments?
Vanessa?
A real and unintended consequence of development is gentrification, and it is outlined in the report, but it wasn't really talked about today. I'm curious why the concern for gentrification wasn't outlined as an action to preemptively avoid. I'm showing a severe risk of gentrification south of the river. Pretty stark information.
Right.
So can you touch on that?
So item I about funding and outreach for rehabilitation of existing low-cost housing. Pardon me, I think I'll decline that. That one's really an anti-gentrification piece. The other thing that the city can do to avoid gentrification is look at where it's implementing some of these different policies and where it's supporting development of housing that's more affordable. So that becomes more of a where are you doing this? So that you can not necessarily, and what are you doing? Not necessarily put a lot of pressure, say, in your urban renewal zone for higher cost housing without also including some of that lower cost housing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Rick?
So back on slide 16. You have
Monitoring?
number 16.
Go forward. You're going backward.
Okay, well, it talks about strategies and annual monitoring. And the question I have, do you have specific examples of what it could look like if you're doing a public event, what would be included in the public event? But also types of different housings, cottage, casita, or boxables. Are those included in your list of ideas, or is that for us to search out, or how would that proceed?
On the types of housing, I understood the cottage. I didn't understand the other two words that you used.
I believe the name is casita, or boxables is another name. Those are small.
Are there?
Those are small homes.
They're like prefabricated housing?
Like which?
Prefabricated housing?
Yes.
Okay. So under the overall monitoring, you could have a monitoring of not just new units by type of housing, but also new units. Well, the type of housing would hit on things like cottage housing, that kind of thing. But also you could monitor whether housing is stick-built or prefabricated if you chose to. I think it's a matter of what you can get out of your building permit system and out of your staff who are doing data entry in the building permit system so that you get consistent information in there. So it's a little bit hard without knowing your building permit system really well to say how much deeper you could get into to monitoring of some of those sorts of things.
Okay, so I guess maybe a better question is how do we get from here to there? And if you have different ideas that will be included in the report.
So I can share with staff different monitoring reports that different cities have developed. Some of them are rather extensive and I think honestly a little too extensive. But some of them might be like what Wilsonville has done in the past, might be more appropriate. I think part of this is staff understanding through conversation with City Council and probably the city manager about what they'd like to see in a monitoring report. And so starting to draft out that kind of monitoring report. But there are examples. Part of this is not providing a draft of a monitoring report, though.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And then you asked some other question that I lost. And I apologize.
I think we're good. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Brian.
Yeah, thank you. I had two questions. The first one is about item C, dedicate surplus city lots for affordable housing development. And that sounds like a good idea, and it is a good idea, although I think just given what the city has as far as inventory of city-owned land, we don't necessarily have much that's currently owned by the city that would be good for that kind of development. We do, however, have land that could potentially be sold, and the proceeds could be used to support some of these other line items, or maybe even rewording that line item to, you know, reallocate funds from property sales to affordable housing development. So that item C, I don't know how feasible or effective that particular wording is going to be in the case for our city. So I don't know if that needs to be potentially talked about being changed, or if we should just leave it, or if it's so far along that it can't be changed, or if I'm off base or what. But I just wanted to bring that to everybody's attention for comment.
No, that's definitely an issue that we talked about. So we haven't talked much in this this action about sale, except in the funding and revenue implications. It says the city could potentially use sale of surplus land to purchase other more desirable lots for future housing development. We could raise that up into the main part of the main part of this a little bit more, and talk about that some under the description. And it's also, when you think about it, it's also that you might be able to buy land in your urban renewal district. And that is one way that this might be implemented.
Okay, I can work with that moving forward. I had one other thing I wanted to discuss that I don't think is on here, and it actually came up at strategic planning, and it's the concept of potentially doing an exchange of urban growth boundary land for more productive urban growth boundary land.
Yeah.
And I think that all of us remember that. Yes, go ahead.
That's a UGB land swap, and just so you know, I worked on one of my first projects at my job here was working on Grants Pass's UGB expansion. I mean, a UGB land swap is easier than an expansion because you don't have to prove the need for the land. You've got land that you're, you know, exchanging out of the UGB. It's something that cities are doing, and I think it might become more common here over the next 5 years. That could be something that we included as an action, or it could be something that we included as a what is the word? Recommendation to evaluate. And it might be something that the city wanted to swap into its HPS a little bit later. I don't know how controversial it would be and how difficult it would be. I'm just remembering the decade and such of UGB expansion, which was pretty tough.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions right now? Not seeing any.
All right, that's all I had for you. So our plan is to come back first to the Planning Commission on February 22nd, and then to the City Council on March 15th.
Thank you for being with us today, Beth. Any questions? Brian?
Are we going to have any discussion on this, or is this informational only?
Not sure what the plan was today. We could talk about it, though. Any questions for Beth? Okay. Rob?
So it's a question for Beth, and I think it's part of what Brian might be talking about. So we have the draft here. I don't know, I think I probably got through the first half of it or so. What exactly is the City Council supposed to do with that draft? Meaning that there are parts of it that seem to me to be no-brainers, parts of it I might agree with, parts of it that there could be paragraphs here or there that I might think are ridiculous. Probably all 8 councilors have similar feelings. What exactly are we supposed to do with the draft, and how are we supposed to interact with you with regards to the draft?
So if you go back to slide 2. So the questions out of here are, do you have any comments? I think we got to the questions mostly. And any considerations before finalizing the draft. So it may well be that, and I don't know exactly what your schedule for this would be, but it may well be that you want to send comments or questions to Amber and Bradley. Yeah.
It's not so much that I mean, I'd be curious to know their opinion, but I think it's comments and questions and possible discussion that I might want to have with the other counselors. But again, I'm just not sure exactly what the purpose of the draft is, or when the council gets to essentially voice its opinion or act on its opinion on the 80 pages
acting on
or
its
whatever.
opinion. The acting on the opinion, I think this is the intention to give the council enough information that it can start having opinions. And then the acting on the opinion, I think I need to defer a little bit to staff on this, but our intention is to bring you a final HPS by March 15th. So we would need your comments and any discussion about changes you'd like over the next couple weeks. We'll be going to the Planning Commission on February 22nd.
Yeah, we can have that discussion now if anybody has comments. I just wanted to make sure we got kind of our background info from Beth first, but if you want to discuss any changes or things that you see here, now would be a good time. Dwayne?
So, I'm just kind of, maybe it's just me, but so the staff is going to give us some supporting ideas that we can talk about and vote on, because there's a whole bunch of stuff here. And we're going to have, say yay or nay, because that's what I want to do is, what we can do and what we can't do. I want to just,
Why don't you give us an
this is a huge packet,
overview?
a lot of stuff that doesn't pertain to us, it
Yeah,
seems like.
let's have Brad give us an overview of what this process is about.
Yeah, so we're working with a state mandate here. The purpose being that we are required as a city to adopt a housing production strategy. It is a multi-year document, so we're not required to do these things tomorrow. That's why you saw the implementation schedule being so long and far out. And to Beth's other point, we do have to report back to the city on what we're doing. So, but correct me if I'm wrong, Amber and Beth, but the statute doesn't actually require us to adopt this until December of this year, correct?
I believe that is correct.
Yeah, I mean, we have a contract with Eco Northwest, that had us ahead of schedule. So we have the adoption by April. But I mean, I guess my point is that if, this is our long range, our 8-year strategy as a city in terms of really focusing on the priorities that you as a council we want us to look at over the next 8 years. Certainly on some of these, and I heard your point, Councilor Juncker, about the timing, and hopefully it was underscored that we can precede the deadlines that are in this document and get them done earlier. I mean, that's certainly always there, but if there's the concerns, and I think what our goal today was, if there's any significant policy issues that you want either staff to look at, or we can take this back to the Planning Commission and go back to them and have them work out some of the details. If you just you want to give some high level concerns that say we want you to look at this in a deeper way, we could certainly take that direction back. But I think one of our goals was to have hear what some of this early enough before it goes to a public hearing, before you're actually scheduled to adopt it, to really just hear that feedback. And if it's in writing, that's great, send it to us. If it's here today, we'll go back and make those edits too.
And I would add on that there's an enormous amount of detail in most of these actions that hasn't been worked out, because this is essentially an action plan for what you'll be doing, how you'll go through making all of those decisions, saying that you want to have a discussion about each of these topics and decide what does your program or what does your policy look like, and there'll be different sorts of discussions.
Joel?
Well, the other thing I think that is implicit, at least I would hope that it would be, is that you just don't have a plan at one point in time and then just follow that plan blindly, and that we look at that plan periodically, because conditions will change, things will get done. There'll be some other things, market-driven or whatever, that maybe make things a little bit difficult, so that we adjust the plan in an appropriate manner to make sense and accomplish our goals. And we just don't have the plan without re-examining it periodically. So it's not, whatever happens this year is the initial plan, but then as we move ahead, there might be things that make it even better.
And there's a built-in point where you have to look at what's going on in the plan halfway through. And of course, you can choose to do it before the halfway mark. But your monitoring program essentially also gives you an opportunity to have those discussions.
Brian, then Val, then Rob.
So, you know, the one that was talked about as potentially the most impactful was the rezoning of land for housing. And I looked through the detailed page of that, and the big one we're actually already doing, it's Allen Creek. I believe that's the one on here that's talking about 61 acres of land, West Harbeck area. So when I look at the other ones, they call out specific numbers of parcels. And if you add all those parcels up, you get about 130 parcels, which, you know, over the course of this plan, honestly is not that much. But this is one of the highest impact categories. So thinking about that, it makes me think about buildable lands inventory. And coming back to looking at this idea of doing the UGB land exchange. And I think that I know that we haven't done the research on that yet, but I think that there's enough potential there for units, given my limited knowledge, that it should certainly be called out in the plan somewhere, if not its own individual action item. So I think, given that DJ and others have discussed that buildable lands inventory is the #1 thing that we need to be looking at, and that's an action that was brought to our attention merely weeks ago, and you know, this plan is coming before us, I think that it should be discussed and potentially put in as an action.
Valerie?
Yeah, I think, you know, I agree with you, Brian, that, you know, that was something that came up to something that we didn't realize we could do and looked like something possible. So I totally agree with that as being something to definitely make as an actual. As we know, the buildable land is so important. I also think a lot of times you end up, you know, first thing we should do is to look at the measurement system and work that out so that we know where we're going towards. And have that kind of lined out as well, because sometimes, and as an educator I will just say, sometimes you'd like to know what your end goal is and where you're going, so that you can, in your mind, kind of check off those things as you go along, so you're not waiting to the very end or even 4 years in, but you're monitoring it on an annual basis and knowing what strategies or what might change along the way and what you have the most success with. So I think, you know, there's a lot of discussion that we can have as we move forward, but I would start with working on what your annual monitoring system can be, and you'll see right under that rezone land for housing. That's right there. So that way we know that that's what we're aiming for along the way.
Rob?
Yeah, I really think that something that I think made it on our strategic plan is going to help us here. I really believe that there's so much here, talking about a fire hose, there's so much here. But I think that if we have every other month meetings with Housing Advisory Committee staff and the home builders, I think that we will actually make progress on these things. And a lot of them, we're going to make progress before the, before the deadlines. It just requires us and staff to stay on them. But without that, I think it'd just be almost like a joke trying to accomplish most of this. But I think if we stay on them, we'll be able to do it. So there's several mentions through here, and again, I only read the first half, so I'm not even sure the second half. But there's several mentions about dealing with homeless populations in here, but there was the first thing I think I saw was on page 4, when they talk about, on the plan itself, not our presentation today, but, or the draft, I should say, when it, in the first paragraph, when it talked about the homeless system action plan, as if it's some kind of action plan, done deal that I'm supposed to know about. I'm not sure what that referred to. Does anyone have any idea what our homeless system action plan is? Page 4, the first paragraph of the draft.
I believe that that is a typo. We should have referred to the particular action related to homelessness. I apologize for
and
that.
what particular action would that have been?
Let me see. That is. Hold on for one moment. I apologize. That is action J.
Okay.
So, development of a resource center for people experiencing homelessness. That's the action we have in here to address homelessness.
Okay. Thank you. So I think on page, and I'm not trying to be overly focused on the homeless situation, but it is throughout this plan. So on page 28, the second paragraph down in the draft, it says address homelessness. It says this initiative seeks to remove barriers and support access to temporary and longer-term housing solutions for those experiencing homelessness, et cetera. You know, I'm not sure exactly how important that is with moving forward with the rest of the plan, but clearly we don't have that yet, and we don't really have any way forward with that yet. So I'm not sure what we're supposed to do with things like that.
So there are a number of the actions in here that, while they aren't specifically just about homelessness, so education, surplus land for housing, so items B and C, the nonprofit low-income housing tax exemption, item H, item J, as I just mentioned, and potential for, sorry about that, Amber, potential for using urban renewal. All of these are tools that can be used to begin to address homelessness. So having more housing that's available for very low-income households, which is what item H is certainly about. And then what you can get developed in your urban renewal district, if you're partnering with nonprofit housing providers for income restricted housing, that can also go towards addressing homelessness. So for instance, if you're looking at building permanent supportive housing, for instance, that's a particular type of housing that is meant for very low income households, many of whom experience homelessness. So there's some nuance to some of that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, is there anything else that anybody wants to bring up today? No? Okay. Well, thanks for going over this with us today, Beth, and we will be in touch.
A lot of information in here. So, thank you.
And I just want to remind you, if you do have any comments as you continue to go through this, just to go ahead and email them to me or bring them to me, and I can make sure we get them to Beth and we work them through with their plan. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, next up we have agenda review. I guess first, before we move on, is everybody good with housing production strategy? Did you want to talk about it anymore today? No? Yes? Go ahead.
Just seems like we've been strategizing for years and not doing as much action. So I'm ready to get to the action part.
We're working on action 2. All right, coming up, first of all, we have a meeting on Wednesday night this week, and we have a public hearing that would consider a change to the development code regarding marijuana businesses, specifically related to the Redwood Hotel downtown. Then we have council action item, we have the request from OnTrack, a funding request. We have a resolution regarding commercial activity in the park for a pickleball event. We have a resolution that would consider commercial activity in the park for a softball event, and a resolution for an SDC matching grant for a property located at 114 Assembly Circle. Then we have several consent agenda items, a resolution that would adopt the construction excise tax or CET investment plan, a resolution for print and mailing services, a resolution for a contract with UCAN regarding emergency shelter services, a resolution regarding a grant for assistance to firefighters, another grant consideration for a wildfire risk reduction grant, then some motions to acknowledge the monthly, quarterly financial reports for June, well, I guess the quarters that ended in June and September and December, and those are starred. So we would get a small presentation on those, and then a motion to acknowledge the System Development Charge Annual Report for fiscal year 2022. And then appointments to the Urban Area Planning Commission, Budget Committee, and the Tree Advisory Committee. Any questions about anything coming up Wednesday? DJ?
There's 3 items on the consent calendar I'd like starred. Construction excise tax investment plan, contract with UCAN for warming shelter, and contract with UCAN for emergency shelter.
Okay, do you just want them pulled off the consent calendar?
Yeah, I would expect a brief presentation and individual vote on those items.
Okay, we'll just move those to council action. Anything else for Wednesday? Okay, and then next week we have a workshop. So at that workshop, we'll have a presentation discussion about 360 review and the zoning transition overlay and the Riverside Park band shell, and then an executive session regarding labor. And then the 13th, so we're gonna have 3 workshops in a row here. We have a workshop with parking ordinance. That is the idea that I think Dwayne brought up about parking around the city. Budget committee orientation that day as well, and a public hearing on the PERS reserve. And that gets us halfway through the month. Any comments? DJ?
February 6th workshop, zoning transition overlay. I would like to invite and expect a representative from the Home Builders Association to opine on that issue.
Okay, I think is that part of the plan? Do we know? That will be part of the plan. Any other questions about those upcoming workshops? All right, then looking forward. Oh, DJ?
Sorry, not those specific workshops, never mind.
Okay, looking forward, is there anything else that you'd like that you have a question about or that you'd like to get on the agenda? DJ?
Let's see here. I'd like to see those meetings with Home Builders Association and Housing Advisory Committee happen post-haste. We're into March and we don't have that on the agenda. I think that's very important. Recommend getting that on the agenda. Also, items related to building and development, specifically identifying the next areas for rezoning. Let's see. We got a memo 002-2023. I recommend everybody read that. I found that it's staff's intention to propose the next area for rezoning if council doesn't do so in 2024. I think that discussion is ripe. I think staff is prepared for it, and it's only a matter of getting it on the agenda and identifying the next zone that we would like to rezone. That's right in line with the housing production strategy, it's right in line with strategic planning, and we should prioritize that on our agenda.
Can I just get clarification on which, to make sure that I know which memo it is? Because
That's 002-2023,
Okay.
Community Development Processes, Policies, and Codes Related to Residential Development.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Were there other ideas? Val?
Yeah, I think we need to have a discussion about our strategic planning that took place. I've had several counselors come to me concerned because some of the highest priorities came up with the mayor's votes being on there, and it's very clear in the charter as well as throughout the council roles and responsibilities that it is the role of the council to set those priorities. So, like I said, I heard that from numerous council. And so at one point I talked to Aaron about what the plan looked like with the council priorities and what the strategic plan looked like without the mayor's, and it was noticeably different. And so due to that, I would really like to have, and I know Karen has run off a list of the things that came up without the mayor's votes on there, and I think that's a discussion that we as a council need to have. And so I would like to have it before, because the strategic plan will be approved on February 15th. And so I think that discussion and what that looks like needs to be addressed before that time.
Okay, so I know that there have been some other concerns about strategic planning as well. Do you want it to just be specific to that issue or talk about the whole strategic planning process?
Well, in this case, I think it has to do with, this is the one that I see as the most important, because it is what the strategic plan is council directed. I mean, it's clear throughout the roles, responsibility, and the charter that is a council directed policy, is at the direction of the council. And the vote, and actually it says in strategic planning specifically that the councilors get the dots and the councilors set the agenda. And so I think that's just that's what I'm asking for at this point. If there's something else that somebody else wants to bring up, that is what I'm bringing forward.
Aaron?
Just as a suggested process, if Council President has heard from other council members that this is something that you're interested in, maybe what you do is we continue to have it scheduled for the council action at the not this business meeting, but the next one in February as scheduled. We'll provide you with a priority list with and without the mayor's vote, and at that meeting, you can adopt through resolution the strategic plan based on either or, one of those two, by just making the motion on whether or not the mayor's vote is included or not, and then it can continue as scheduled.
Would that work, or do you need a workshop on it?
I'm just going to ask what the council, because like I said, I heard from numerous people, whether I'm fine with me.
Question?
I think we're opening a really interesting box. If this has been practiced for years and years that the mayor has participated, I mean, I'd be curious to see how many other strategic plans could be altered.
All right, well, it sounds like there's probably some room for discussion about this, but yeah, I guess I'm not sure how it feels to the group, if you want to have that be a workshop or if it can just be handled on the 15th. So are you requesting a workshop, Valerie?
No, I think as long as we get the information ahead of time and it's put out there, that we can deal with it on the 15th.
Okay. Dwayne?
I don't think there is a reason for a workshop or a discussion. I can read you the rules directly from the charter.
Okay, well, then you're getting into the... No, stop. This is agenda review. We're not having the full discussion now.
This is the agenda that the council sets, and the council gets to make the agenda. No
Okay.
one else gets to make it but the council.
Okay, but we're not having a full-on discussion about that right now.
We're going to have a debate about it. I don't think there is
just-
a debate about it. I think the rules are already set, and I could read those rules.
Okay.
It's not a debate.
Okay, we're going to move on. We will put it on the February 15th business meeting agenda if Valerie and I will be having an agenda-setting meeting, and we can move it to a workshop if that's what we decide during that agenda-setting meeting, but this is not the place to be having that debate.
Like I said, we could just include that as an additional option, so you have 2 options for the packet for the 15th.
Personally, I think that would be sufficient, but like I said, go to Valerie if you want it to be a workshop. Do you have a different topic?
Can I just ask a really quick question?
If it's very quick.
Aaron, how long has the mayor been participating in that scoring?
Hey, if we're going to hold
Let's talk about
standards
that
to
later. We're
discussion,
just-
we need to hold a standard across the board.
Yeah, we're just talking about the agenda right now. So if you have questions about background on a particular issue, let's do that at a different time. Anything else for the agenda at the moment? Okay. We haven't met yet, DJ, since strategic planning. So we will be getting the bi-monthly meetings going and starting to look at housing topics too. Okay. Anything else for agenda? All right. How about we have a motion to adjourn into our special meeting for the urban renewal?
I make a motion to get out of regular session and go into executive session.
Oh, it's not an executive, it's not executive, it's just an urban renewal.
Urban renewal meeting, special session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Special session.
Second from Joel. All in favor of adjourning the city council workshop and moving into the special meeting? Say aye. Any opposed? All right. We will adjourn the meeting, and we are now reconvening as the Urban Renewal Agency. And we have a consent agenda item that it looks like JC is going to review with us.
Hello, I'm here today to report on the Urban Renewal Agency and its annual report and the ORSs that we are abiding by. So while we're here, excuse me. So while we're here in a special meeting, we have to do the city's financials alongside the URA's financials. And I can't put together this report until those are done. And that didn't happen until after Christmas, and we have several things, holidays, auditor communications, filing with the federal government for our single audit because we have more than $750,000 in expenditures. And that leads us to the Urban Renewal Agency, and also missing a meeting in January because of strategic planning, which is why I'm here today, which transitions into these requirements. We need to provide to the council by January 31st after fiscal year end of June 30th. As well as the requirements of this report are tax incremental financing revenues, the expenditures, the next year's budget, and then the impact on the taxing districts. So here are the revenues for fiscal year 2022. It's a little bit over $1.3 million for the TIF, or tax incremental financing revenues, and small amount of interest. The expenditures for 2022 are a little over $11,000, and that makes up the cost for audit, staff time, and public announcements, which we are required after this meeting, if you approve this, to put 2 public announcements out in the Courier. The next table is table 4, and it is the 2023 budget, and you can see the revenues as well as the expenditures. And that capital outlay, it was not allocated at the time to any one individual project or many projects. However, over the time period, the Bohemian was allocated $55,000 this year. Here's the impact on all the taxing districts. I'm not going to go through and read them, but you can see the city was impacted by about $554,000. I kind of put special little hats there for the school districts, as well as the education service. So yes, we do impact them as far as the URA. However, they do have some state funding that makes up for the difference, so they're not necessarily operating at a loss. And then the call to action would be today, and then there's a potential motion up there. And are there any questions?
Any questions? No? All right. Oh, Valerie, go ahead.
You go through that really fast, and my brain doesn't quite work as fast as yours does, not quite. So I just kind of want on the 2022-2023 Urban Renewal Fund, the contractual professional services, that is items that our staff, that sort of thing? Is that what that is?
So there, the contractual, yes, is partly direct charges from my department, CD, and then Aaron's time as well. You also have the audit costs individually for the URA. Anytime that we do a publication, so when we do the budget announcement, those kinds of charges are in those contractual professional services.
And that, how does it differ from the direct charges?
I believe the direct charges is, that's Dana's time, the new urban renewal agency manager. And again, piece of my time, I think, is what makes up that 90,000.
And then capital outlay, does that mean that has been spent? I mean, because we didn't outlay that. I guess I
No,
just want
so
clarification.
it's a placeholder to give you
Okay.
flexibility to spend it in the event that you had something that came forward,
And
like the Bohemian.
Yeah, and so that 55,000 came out of that fund. That's what I'm clear, because you mentioned the Bohemian 55,000, but I don't see that itemized anywhere. So that's why what you're saying is that came out of the capital outlay. And
That
that
is
includes
correct.
all the money that could have been spent, but we didn't spend. The 55,000 is what has been spent. How about the pool or any of that? Has any of those?
So nothing has been directly allocated to any one project of those funds. So at the time of budgeting in May of last year, there was also discussion of potentially giving the water treatment plant $3.5 million to front load for future debt. And so it's a placeholder to allow for you to spend the money if it were to come up.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Nope. Thank you, JC. All right, this is just a consent calendar item, so not slated for discussion, but does anyone want to make a motion?
I'll make a
Go ahead, Dwayne.
I make motion to acknowledge the receipt of the Grants Pass Urban Renewal Agency Annual Report for fiscal year 2022.
Seconded by Val, and let's see, Dwayne, you made the motion to acknowledge the receipt, rather. How do you vote?
Yay.
Brian?
Yes.
DJ?
Yes.
Rick?
Yes.
Vanessa?
Yes.
Joel?
Yes.
Valerie?
Yes.
Rob?
Yes.
Motion passes 8-0. And how about a motion to adjourn? Brian?
I move to adjourn.
Seconded by Valerie. All in favor of adjourning the URA meeting, say aye.
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 Any opposed? All right, we are adjourned, and see you Wednesday night.